All right, guys. So, welcome everybody to the Forage College. Justin is tied up at the State 4-H Horse Show, so he asked Brian and I to kind of take over this for him this evening, since we're the two speakers. And so, I think most of you know Brian Pugh. Brian Pugh is the area agronomist. Brian is probably one of the foremost experts on when we come to forage and forage production and stuff, and really knows his stuff. And so I'm always really excited to listen to him talk, because he usually teaches me something else that I'd either didn't know or I'd forgot that I'd known. So, but with that, I'm gonna turn it over to Brian, and away you can go, sir.
Well, thank you, JJ. You're putting a lot of pressure on me there. I wouldn't say that I'm an expert, but luckily tonight we're talking about something that I am pretty passionate about. It's probably one of my favorite topics to work with producers on, and something that I've done on my own place for well over a decade now that really makes a big impact to your bottom line. And I know in one of our previous meetings, we did talk a little bit about this, and that is how to use basically stockpile forages, winter grazing systems to minimize some of those feeding costs, put a little more money in our pocket at the end of the year. So the picture you're looking at here was a couple of years ago. I shot a few videos. I want to say that was either a late January or early February day. My cows were on stockpile fescue there, grazing down, digging through that little bit of snow there, 2 or 3 inches of snow, and getting to that fescue. And again, I wasn't feeding any hay. I wasn't feeding any supplement to those cows up through that point. And it almost just totally got through the winter there. So, you know, it does take work to get to kind of the end result of these systems, but it's very doable if you kind of take it in piecewise chunks. And that's what we're going to spend time talking about mainly here tonight, is that first step. And for me, that first step is stockpiling Bermuda grass. So we'll go ahead and get started. And like JJ said, if you have questions, feel free to ask. JJ, you may have to help me because I am not seeing the videos of people on the side, and I'm not seeing my chat box. So you can interrupt.
I'll monitor the I'll monitor the chat box for you. So.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so kind of to get going, I always like to start this off with kind of getting each of you as a producer in the same mindset. You know, when I sit down and look at this, or an ag economist like JJ or Scott that I work with, even a livestock specialist like Brian Frecking that's on here, Earl, you know, when we sit down and look at these systems, we try to figure out, you know, where is that low hanging fruit? Where can we make the biggest impact first, or the biggest impact with the least amount of input? And for me, really, that low hanging fruit is the fact that feed, what we poke in the front end of the cow, is the biggest cost of that cow ownership. If we look at KFMA data, I think we talked about this in one of our previous meetings. That's Kansas Farm Management. They keep some really good records on actual farms, actual ranching operations. And if we look over the last 10 or 12 years, routinely, we see that somewhere around half of our annual cost to that cow is in feed. Now, a lot of people think that feed is something we pour out of a bag. That's kind of a slang term that we give it, but really what feed is, you should consider that when you hear that tonight as food. That's anything we put in the front end of a cow. So that would be supplement that comes out of a bag or out of a bin. That would be hay, or that would be forage that we graze the cow herd on. An average winter daily cost, just ballparking it, is about $1.50 per cow per day. Okay, and I've got, this is a little older data here. You're going to see that when I throw up the byproduct feed costs, but at $35 for a bale of hay, 1,100 pound bale of hay, that cow eating free choice, she's going to consume 30 pounds, not assuming any waste, any loss. That's 96 cents of hay per cow per day. And if we're feeding a $240 a ton byproduct feed, that's 12 cents per pound. If we feed it at 4 pounds, that's 48 cents per cow per day. That same byproduct feed today is going to cost you about $300 a ton. So we're looking at about 60 cents per cow per day. So again, $1.50 to $1.60 per cow per day is a rough rule of thumb, and we're not assuming any waste in those numbers. So I want you to lock that number in your head. I always tell producers, don't worry about what a bale of hay costs or a ton of feed costs or any of that. What we really want to worry about is what is our cost per cow per day. That's the only way we can compare maybe different avenues of feeding cattle. We can actually compare from one year to the next with that type of method and still be comparing apples to apples in a way. So break it down to what it costs you per cow per day. The next step of this process, thinking our way through this, I like to show this, and this is getting some age on it now. My predecessor, Bob Woods, put this survey together back in the day. I want to say I had about 800 responses to this survey. We duplicated this study or this survey at Haskell a few years back at our field day. A little bit over 100 producers showed up to that, and the results were very similar to this. But basically what we ask is, how many days are you actually feeding your cow herd in the winter? And basically what I want you to really key in on is those two right-hand columns, these two right over here. And basically what we're seeing is about 80% of producers indicated they feed more than 90 days of hay and supplement. And really, if we look, there's very few producers that are getting down here less than 60 days of hay and supplement. And what we tended to notice from that survey was that the ones who were falling over there on the left, feeding very little hay, very little stored hay to those cattle, were actually producers in that Osage region of Oklahoma. So they're traditionally native grass operators. They're running a cow per 10 acres, a cow per 12 acres. They've got a lot of standing forage going into the winter. And really all they need to do is supplement some protein to those cows. So a lot of our introduced forage growers are Bermuda grass, even people that had fescue, maybe crabgrass, bahia if you're farther down in the southeast. A lot of us are feeding well over 90 days of hay and feed. So why would we start with Bermuda? And again, that's what we're going to talk about tonight, is how to stockpile Bermuda and start making a dent, chipping away at that winter feeding system and saving some money. And really the reason I like to start with Bermuda is if we're talking about eastern Oklahoma, pretty much every producer has some Bermuda grass. And really probably 2/3 of our producers in eastern Oklahoma want Bermuda to be their main forage. So we have a lot of it already out there in the pasture. This is a little bit of an old number. I probably need to modify this, but 10 years ago, I used to say that pretty much every producer really didn't manage Bermuda effectively after September 1. I've heard so many times people say, well, once you get past September, Bermuda is pretty much done. And I'll show you a slide with some data here in a minute that I hope will change your mind on that. I think the new number that I would put up there now is probably 85%. I feel like I'm getting a lot more producers that call me. I talk to when I'm out and about that say they're now using stockpile Bermuda grass and using it effectively. So I feel like we're making some headway, but we got a long ways to go. And again, why start with Bermuda? Remember that low-hanging fruit. Bermuda grass, a lot of us think it is the king of forages, and some of those reasons. It's already established. It's a perennial forage, perennial grass. It comes back year after year. It's very resilient. It's going to stand up to droughts that we have, stand up to grazing, highly responsive to nitrogen if we're willing to fertilize it, and it will meet a cow's nutrient requirements. Now, I saw Brian Frecking was on here. Brian's a livestock specialist, got some background in nutrition. He will tell you that you're not going to put loads and loads of weight on a cow on Bermuda grass. It's not that kind of a grass, but it typically is, if we manage it correctly, just enough to meet that cow herd's requirements. And again, that's good enough to keep us from having to supplement that cow. The next thing I like to always show here is this screen, and this is basically Oklahoma data. If you'll look at the orange line, so this orange line, we've got these boxes across here. And what these boxes denote is essentially the percentage of total seasonal production that falls in that month. So what this is saying is that in June, Bermuda grass is going to produce about 24% of its total growth. In July, about 14%. And what I always try to point out to producers is if we go down to September 1 on towards frost, what we see is about 25% of Bermuda's total production occurs after September 1. Now, I will tell you, and a lot of other agronomists will tell you, in eastern Oklahoma with our rainfall, we know that common Bermuda grass, if you manage it correctly, will produce 4 to 5 tons per acre per year, year after year. That's our running average. So if we're going to produce 25% of that after September 1, what that means is we can fairly easily make 1 ton of additional production per acre after September 1. And that's going to be real important. We're going to come back to that here in a few slides. The other thing I want to point out is this blue line here, and that is our rainfall as we go through the year. Now, I will tell you, every county in Oklahoma is going to be a little different. The magnitude of that rainfall is going to be different. But what we do see is that Oklahoma in general has a bimodal rainfall pattern. So that means we get a peak of rain in April, May, and June, and we also get a peak of rainfall in September and October. The nice thing about this is that, oftentimes we get into drought situations in the summer. That is not a real secure time to be putting fertility down and hoping to get a rain on top of it. But what we do know is that one of the most secure months to get rainfall on forage is actually September. And I went back through 110 years of Oklahoma data in a lot of the eastern 40 counties, and you'll see that very rarely do we get less than 4 inches of rainfall in September, and 4 inches of rain is enough to make 1 ton of additional forage. So again, take all this into account. The best time possibly to be putting fertility down as far as a rainfall standpoint could be September. So that leads us right into talking a little bit about how do we stockpile Bermuda grass for cattle. I want to start off by saying one of the biggest issues I have seen with this, one of the things that I think really catches some producers. I've had some call me and say, I tried to do what you was talking about and stockpile that Bermuda, and man, the cows didn't want to eat it. I forced them on it and they were losing weight every day. And as I would get talking to that producer, what I'd find out is they didn't fertilize it in the fall. And really it was Bermuda grass that was grown in June and possibly July. It was old summer deferred forage. And that's not what we're talking about here tonight. We're not talking about grass that you grow right now this time of year, and then you hold it for cows until November or December. That's going to be very low quality forage. It will not meet a cow's protein or energy requirements. What we are talking about tonight is intensively and purposefully managing that Bermuda for good enough quality to meet her requirements. So let's talk about how we do that. The first thing that we need to think about doing somewhere around the 1st of September is we need to remove any existing forage. So if that grass out there is boot top deep, we need to get that knocked back down to that 2 to 3 inch height. And we can do that various ways. My favorite way to do that is to graze it with the cow herd. Use the cows to remove that existing forage. If that's not an option, if you've got too much grass for the number of cows you got, you could go in and bale that for hay. Or my last option there, my last resort is to clip that with, say, a mower or a brush hog. But try to get it back down short. And the reason we want to do that is because we know that fresh new regrowth is going to be very high quality growth. Okay. That old yellow colored stem that's standing up there and has been there for, possibly 3 months, it's going to be extremely low quality. So we don't want that in this stockpile grass that we're making these cows eat. So get it clipped down. Apply somewhere from 50 to 75 pounds of actual N, and those prices right there will be wrong. I bet JJ will probably cover this in a little more detail tonight. But again, 50 to 75 pounds of N, no more than 75 pounds because we typically just can't use that much in the fall. And expect about 1 ton of forage production per acre. Now, this is dependent on the soils that you have there and also the rainfall that we get. Typically, we see that 1 ton holds true for most sites. I do have some sites, and I'll show you some data from Perkins here in a little bit, where we're routinely making over 2 tons of Bermuda grass production after September 1. So again, you're going to have some variability there. We're going to target grazing on this after frost when that growth is complete. So we're letting this plant grow ungrazed in that September, October timeframe, and then we're going to start to use it somewhere around frost or slightly before if you need it. Now you might notice that bottom bullet point, I say use it when you need it. I've had a few people call me and say, you know, Brian, you mentioned in a meeting, use stockpile Bermuda from November 1 until Christmas. Well, I ran out of grass on October 20th and my cows stood there hungry for 10 days. Don't hold me to these calendar dates. These are rough rules of thumb. And as soon as you need grass, you go to that stockpile Bermuda. It doesn't matter if it's earlier in October. Typically 1 acre, if we get that 1 ton of production, and depending on how we graze it, is going to give us about 45 to 60 grazing days for a 1,200 pound cow. And that's pretty significant. And I'll show you how significant that is here in a few minutes. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what's happening there in the plant. And I always talk about tripping that fall stopwatch. So the date that the N is applied to the field, that's going to be important. We can't be waiting around. We really need to get out there and try to get these fields short and get them fertilized somewhere by September 15th is always my goal. I tell producers don't get caught waiting on a rain. Bob Woods used to be notorious, and Chris Rice saying, you know, if you're waiting on 1 rain, you're really waiting on 2, because often those rains sneak up on us and we miss them. So again, try to get that nitrogen down. A lot of people are scared of urea in the fall, but honestly, in eastern Oklahoma on acidic soils like we have, most research shows rarely do we exceed 15% nitrogen loss. So again, we're not going to see big losses in nitrogen. And a lot of the trials that we've done on producers and on our research stations show that. We still get great yields from using this nitrogen in the fall. Here was a trial that Chris Rice and I did back in 2005. That was a very extreme drought. We did put down on this application was 100 pounds of actual N. This was part of another study. But again, this was put down the last week of August. And I think it shows us again that, yeah, we numerically, we were a little bit lower on our yield from urea, but we still made over 2,000 pounds of production and we didn't lose it all. And I've heard that so many times. If you don't get a rain on it in 30 minutes, you're going to lose all of that nitrogen. And again, research shows that's just not the case. So don't be scared of getting the nitrogen down. That's what's going to drive this system. I always also try to tell people to reassure them you're going to lose more yield from waiting and that having a shortened growth period in the fall than what you will nitrogen losses from volatilization. So every day we continue to wait to get that nitrogen down, days are getting shorter, nights are getting cooler, and we're losing potential yield on that Bermuda. So again, try to shoot for the first couple weeks of September. Now, really the date that trips that stopwatch is not when we apply the fertilizer, but it's when we get that first ½ inch of rain. And typically we say on good moist soils, a ½ inch of rain will dissolve those prills and get it into the root zone. But on average, we would like to see at least a ½ inch of good slow rain to put it into the rooting zone. And then we can see nutrient uptake within 24 to 48 hours. Soil moisture alone will dissolve those prills and causes a color change in the grass, but we still need rain in a few days after that, or we might start to see some of those ammonia losses that we were talking about earlier. Okay. So the next date that we're really worried about, now we put the fertilizer down, we've got the rain, that starts the stopwatch clicking. Now the next date we're worried about is when does that stopwatch stop? And that is where the killing frost essentially ceases the growth of that Bermuda grass. It's where it stops growth. And the reason this is important is because this is going to dictate not only yield of that Bermuda grass plant, but also the quality of that Bermuda grass plant. And that's very important because again, Not only are we trying to replace hay and give her enough forage that she can graze every day and not need hay, but we're trying to shoot for quality high enough that it meets her protein and energy requirement. And she also won't need supplement. So again, this is a little bit dealing or relying on Mother Nature, and that can be tricky. This graph is just a smooth curve from quite a bit of data I have from different trials. What you see here on this yield in the fall is that we've got this slow growth curve. And again, we continue to increase that yield until we get into that reproductive stage where those seed heads are being produced. Okay, and again, some people say, well, I want as much quantity as possible. And that's okay, but what you need to understand is the way a forage plant works. Every day we continue to grow and add leaf mass, add tissue onto that plant. We also need to add a stronger stem and more stem. And within that stem, we deposit lignin, and lignin is indigestible. So what we see is that as we increase yield of a plant, actually quality of that plant goes down. So energy is dropping daily, crude protein is dropping daily. What we're hoping is that frost kills that plant somewhere in here where we're still above that cow's requirements, and we've optimized the production, not maximized it, but we've optimized the production and the quality. I hope that, I know that's quick going through that, but I hope that's kind of clear to everyone. Ideally, for most forage plants, we see somewhere around 6 weeks, plants really shift from vegetative growth into reproductive growth. 6 weeks tends to coincide with somewhere around this between a dry and lactating cow's requirements. The numbers you're seeing up there on the screen, a dry cow's protein requirement is about 8%, and her energy requirement or TDN requirement is about 53. If we get on up to about 8 weeks of growth on that Bermuda, we may fall a little below that. So it may require some supplementation. Okay, so again, this is a learning process. It's not something you're going to do perfectly the first year, but most producers after 2 to 3 years of stockpiling Bermuda, they're really getting a feel for this system, and they understand what to do to help those cows along if they need to supplement. Again, this just shows if we have an early frost, our yields will be depressed, but we're going to have much higher quality stockpiles. So we would expect those cows to gain some weight on that stockpile. And the opposite thing, if we get a late frost, we get huge yields, but again, fairly low quality. Now, this would be a strategy for a hay replacement scenario. If JJ tells you hay is bringing $80 a bale, you know, we could have a hay replacement strategy here where we know we need to supplement those cows, but possibly hay is the most expensive thing going in her mouth every day. So I think I belabored that point as much as I should. Let's move on to how we utilize the stockpile Bermuda. And really, there's different options here. The simplest option is to have that 1 acre per cow, and it's one big field, and we open the gate, turn the cows into it somewhere around the 1st of November. Maybe when your summer grass runs out, we open the gate and turn them in, and they can go in and graze that stockpile Bermuda. What you need to understand is that your utilization or your efficiency, harvest efficiency, is fairly low when we do that. Okay, so a lot of that grass we grow, it's going to get trampled on and defecated on, and we put a lot of labor, a lot of money into that grass that we stockpile, so we want to conserve it. So really what I'm a big proponent of in these stockpile systems is strip grazing. And again, I hear people say, man, I don't want to go out there and move a fence 3 times a day. You don't have to. You know, I always say this in a lot of these meetings. I work during the week. I do a lot of night meetings like this. I really rely on a 7-day strip. I try to move my fences on the weekends. And even doing that, even moving that fence every 6-7 days is enough to show you an advantage in utilization of that forage. So anything we can do to get more of those pounds of forage we grow in the cow's mouth, the more money we're going to leave in our pocket. There's a lot of data here, and I'm not going to spend much time on it, but this was some work we did at Perkins Research Station. We had a 42 cow herd up there. We looked at one field of stockpile Bermuda. We just turned them in on it, continuous graze. We actually went in and sampled all across that field and got an average forage production. You'll notice there we made almost 3,000 pounds per acre. Really good yields on that Bermuda. And continuous grazing, we got 17 days of grazing with 42 cows on 12 acres. Not bad. We didn't feed any supplement or any hay to those cows. And we had about 20 minutes of labor involved in that. We moved those cows from this continuous graze paddock over to the other side. If you've ever been to the Perkins station there, Sonic sets right here on the corner. This is called the Sonic Trap. What we decided to do is we were going to move a strip fence about every 3 to 5 days. And that's what we did. We ended up with a little better yield on that site, 4,400 pounds. But once we strip grazed those cows through, it was about 2.75 hours of total labor that we had put in on that site. And we got essentially 40 days of grazing. So I won't go into all this, but what I did is I went back and looked at the disappearance rate of that forage based on how those cows were grazing. And what we found is on the continuous graze, we got about 57% utilization. On the strip graze at somewhere around a 4-day average fence move, we got about a 71% utilization. And that may not sound like a lot, but essentially what that meant is that by strip grazing the Sonic Trap, we were able to gain an additional 8 days of grazing where we didn't have to feed hay and we didn't have to feed supplement. That 8 days on that 42 cow herd was worth about $522 that we saved. The entire fencing setup, which hopefully you can see down here in the corner, cost us $336. So we ended up paying for the entire fencing setup just in about a 40-day period there. So again, I will tell you, strip grazing, it sounds like it's a lot of work, but it's really not, especially if you compare it to running out there with a feed truck, setting a bale of hay out and feeding in troughs every day. You know, we would go out there once every 4 days and it'd take one person about 10 minutes to move that fence. So that's not a bad use of your time, and you're also putting a little more money in your pocket at the end of the day. This is just a picture, a couple strips in. You can see here these cows, and that's a very hot fence there. We've got a solar charger on that, but that fence was testing right at 12,000 volts. Those cows figure out real quick that they can get down on their knees and reach under that. That's why you're seeing that line over here to the right of the fence. They're actually reaching under that one wire. But we really don't have a lot of problem with them trying to bust the fence down if you've got a good hot charger. Okay. Some of the things to watch out for. I actually had an educator ask me, why don't you need to put a slide in there about some of the pitfalls that you've ran into over the last 15 years stockpiling Bermuda. And here's some of the ones that I've ran into either on my own property, my own place, or working with producers in the past. The first one I would tell you is take a standing forage sample. Okay, work with your county educator, take them a forage sample that you can send off right there around frost. That way you know what the quality is, because most of us, when we stand there and we look at this field, we feel like that is super low quality. There's no way a cow can make it on that. What that forage test is going to do is give you confidence to go ahead and let those cows graze through that, because the first time you've ever put them on stockpile Bermuda, they're going to moan and bellyache a little bit. They're going to want you to come out there with the feed truck. The key is you need to have confidence that what you're putting in front of them meets her protein and energy requirements, and you're going to make her graze on through that. Some of the other things to remember is that your leaves contain the bulk of the quality. Okay, there's not a whole lot of goody, so to speak, in the stem of that Bermuda grass plant. So again, you got to think about, if we get a lot of rain in that November, December time period, it's really wet. That Bermuda grass plant degrades fairly rapidly. It essentially rots. Those leaves fall off to the ground. You're left with a lot of stem out there, but that stem is not very good quality. So that's something that can hurt us and actually decrease the length of the grazing season in the fall. Also, another thing that you need to think about is just how tight are you willing to make those cows graze. The tighter you graze it, the lower quality that cow's overall diet is going to be, because she's eating more of that stem. Okay, so you need to think about that. If my cows were in poor shape, I probably wouldn't be making them graze this quite as tight. If my cows are in good shape, they're in good body condition, it's okay to make them utilize a little bit more of that forage. But again, these are just all strategies we can use to really fine tune this system and make it fit what we're trying to do. Another big issue that I've seen with stockpile Bermuda, and this has bit me before pretty hard, is that inclement weather, ice or pretty deep snow. It's a game changer on stockpile Bermuda. Cows are rarely going to want to go back to stockpile Bermuda once you've fed them some hay and some supplement. Now, it's not that way if we're talking about fescue or wheat. Cows will dig through snow to get to fescue and wheat. But once we start feeding some hay on the stockpile Bermuda, it's very hard to get them to go back. I tell the story a few years back. I had just been on stockpile Bermuda about 10 days, was in the middle of November. We got a little sheet of ice and a little bit of snow, and the cows quit. They come up by the gate for a full day. We put a couple bales of hay out for them, fed them, and I basically lost the rest of my stockpile Bermuda. I could not make those cows go back and graze it after that. So again, keep that in mind. You know, there are going to be years where that inclement weather sneaks up on us. Other things to think about: lactating cows. If you've got a fall calving cow herd, they are really riding the edge of the quality that we can expect to get out of stockpile Bermuda. You really need to monitor the body condition score and those manure pats on those cows. My experience, and I run both spring and fall calving herds, my experience has been November, I really don't have a problem meeting those cows' requirements. But as we get into December, it gets a little cooler. The quality of that Bermuda degrades a little more. Then I probably need to start supplementing a little bit of energy to those fall calving cows. So keep that in mind. A couple other questions I got, is it a problem grazing that Bermuda really, really tight when it's dormant? And the answer is no. You're not going to hurt the Bermuda grass. That Bermuda is not alive above the soil surface after a killing frost. So you're not going to hurt it. Now, what you might see is, because you open up that canopy, we get a lot of sunlight to the soil surface in late winter, we might have a lot of cool season weeds pop up the next spring that need to be addressed. So we can increase some cool season weeds the next year if we're not careful. And then I sometimes get a question: what about tight grazing prior to a frost? And I'll try to stay away from that as best as possible. So I tell people, don't start strip grazing until you've actually had a killing frost that has browned that forage out. And the reason is, if we strip graze and we graze that Bermuda all the way to the ground, we run a higher risk of having some winter kill on that Bermuda stand. And again, that's not something that we want to get into. So maybe look at a continuous graze scenario until frost occurs, and then move them back into a strip grazing strategy after that. Okay. Starting out with our first station here, this is our Perkins station. We do a field day every fall. We didn't get to last year due to COVID, but we have a winter forage field day. You're more than welcome to attend that field day. We'd love to have you up. You can see exactly what's happening. We'll actually move the fence, and you can watch those cows move on to a new strip while you're there. So it's a pretty cool deal. But this cow herd, what we're trying to do in that Perkins area is show, can we intensively manage a herd long term? And again, we're going to get into droughts in Payne County, but what we want to show is that by having a winter grazing system, the effects of a drought are much reduced compared to if we were relying on hay and supplement all the way through the winter. So we've got 115 grazable acres, 42 cow herd. Last summer, we actually run 55 cows. We're making so much forage on that and utilizing it so well now, we can run quite a few more cows than what we had originally. But I'll show you the data here from when we had 42 cows. Originally, we had about 150-day hay and supplementation system. We bumped that down in the very first year to 59 days of winter feeding. And I'll show you the Bermuda portion of this. Again, our Bermuda hay that we're baling on site's pretty good hay, testing about 11% protein, about 61 TDN. I know we talked about a dry cow's requirements was 8% protein, 53 TDN, but a lactating cow's requirements is about 10% protein, 58, 59 TDN. So what you should be seeing is that our hay alone would even suffice for a fall calving cow, for a lactating cow. But here's the really interesting thing. If you look at our stockpile Bermuda in 2018 and in 2019, both years, we actually had better quality stockpile Bermuda than we had Bermuda hay. So again, I tell people it's essentially a standing hay crop. It's hay on the stump out there in the field that we can use the cow to harvest. And you can see here again, our production pretty good on average for both of those years. And you can see what our feeding cost per cow per day is as well. So we're running down there in 2018, 35 cents per cow per day. In 2019, about 43 cents per cow per day. If you remember back to that first slide I showed you tonight, 4 pounds of a byproduct feed right now is about 60 cents per cow per day. And we're not even counting the hay. So again, that's a very cheap way to supplement a cow. She's not needing hay. She's not needing supplement when she's on that good quality stockpile Bermuda. Okay, essentially what we did is we went from about 600 pounds of supplement per cow down to 132 pounds of supplement per cow in that first year. And we knocked our hay feeding from about 4.1 bales per cow down to about 1.6 bales per cow. So JJ's looking at this right now and immediately he's seeing dollar signs. And that's what I see. That adds up very quickly when we can start to reduce hay and supplement at that level. Now you might ask, well, what about the cow's condition? You know, did we make her lose a bunch of weight by strip grazing her through that Bermuda? And what I would point to is right over here, we tried to take weights of these cows every time we changed a forage component that they were on. So again, we started that first year out at about 1,284 pounds. 57 days later, we had gained like 2 pounds on that cow herd. Now, really, that's nothing. That tells us we didn't really change the weight. But for me, that is a major win because for 2 months, we actually maintained that cow's weight and we did it very economically. So again, I hope you see that stockpile Bermuda can really work for you and not hurt your cow performance. I also like to show this because, you know, one of the big questions is if we make cows eat that dead yellow grass standing out there. And again, I hope you're seeing just because it's brown and dead, that doesn't mean that it's low quality if we're managing it correctly. But one of the questions was, are we going to hurt our conception rate? So actually, we took a herd of cows. Those 42 cows were all second round AI cows or later. They were all second round AI or bull breds. And what we were able to do is move almost 50% of that herd into that first round of AI. Now, I'm not trying to tell you that stockpile Bermuda is what moved those cows up, but what I am saying is that our grazing system did not hurt the performance of that cow and therefore did not hurt conception rates of those cows. So keep that in mind. If we're meeting her protein, we're meeting her energy requirements every day of the year, we're going to have some really happy cows. Cost, and there's a lot that goes in here. You know, the pasture cost, this is the one that scares a lot of people because we went in, we put fertility down in September. We used to spend nothing per cow in that fall period on pasture. Now we're spending $37 a cow, and that can be a little bit scary. That's money we're writing a check for. And again, it's like, oh man, I don't know if I'm going to get any good out of that. But if we go up here and look at the amount of feed reduction from $66 to $14, hay reduction went from $143 to $56. What we ended up with was about $101 net increase for that cow herd on a per head basis. So again, that was about a $4,200 savings in the very first year just from stockpiling Bermuda that we could then use for other forage management factors in year 2 and year 3. A little bit more data here. This is a bigger operation that we have. This is our research station at Valiant, Oklahoma, 272 cow herd at the time, 945 grazable acres. We essentially implemented the same thing. We're just going to show you the stockpile Bermuda data here tonight. The very first year, we went from 135 days of feeding hay and supplement down to about 84 days of hay and supplement just by implementing some of these strategies. Again, this is coastal Bermuda hay that you're looking at, 11.3 protein, 62 TDN. That's a really good Bermuda grass hay sample. Very good energy on that hay there. But once again, I'll point out our stockpile Bermuda was not too far behind that. Our yields were a little low in 2018, about 2,200 pounds per acre. That's that 1 ton per acre that we use as a rule of thumb. We ended up getting about 38 grazing days. This was a half acre per cow is the amount that we fertilized this year. I convinced the higher ups that it was working, so they gave me enough money to fertilize 1 acre per cow the next year, and we got 76 days of grazing at just over 3,000 pounds of Bermuda per acre at roughly 1 acre per cow. So 76 days of grazing, that's 2.5 months. That basically got us into mid-January before we ever had to start considering hay or supplement for that cow herd. And again, our cost really, really good compared to what we're seeing today for hay and supplement. Here was traditionally the amount of supplement we fed per cow was pretty large at that station, 600 pounds. We did end up splitting the herd after the stockpile Bermuda. We went to a group of young cows, 3s, 4s, and 5s, and then those older cows. And what we saw, we fed about 200 pounds of supplement to the young cows to keep their body condition up, and no supplement to those older cows. We were able just to feed them hay and meet their requirements. And we saved about 1 bale per cow on average there just in that first year stockpiling Bermuda. Again, I'll point out our performance on that stockpile Bermuda. We did lose about 10 pounds of weight over 38 days in the first year. A lot of that was because we did a 1-day strip graze. So we moved that fence every day. We really made those cows graze that down pretty tight and utilize it well. We got 81% utilization of the Bermuda, but again, we're not going to expect to see cows gain 30 or 40 pounds when we're making them graze that grass that tight. But again, 10 pounds of loss, that's essentially 1 gallon of water. So we felt like we did pretty good maintaining their body weight in that first year. Same thing here, conception rates. Just want to show you, we did increase conception rates in 2019 compared to 2018. And most of that's due to just forage management, proper use of that forage at a higher quality stage of growth. So stockpiling that Bermuda did not hurt us when it comes to the cow's body weight or the conception rate of those cows in that herd. And again, at a half acre per cow, we saved about $56 per cow winter cost savings. We essentially double that in year 2, and I don't have that data here, but when we went to 1 acre per cow and got that 76 additional days of grazing, we were right up around $120 per cow of savings just for the Bermuda grass component. So it's definitely something that can save you a lot of money. That's going to kind of wrap up what I wanted to talk about here tonight on stockpiling Bermuda. And again, I think all of us have some Bermuda in our pastures. My challenge to you is we're setting at a prime time here in the summer to begin thinking and planning on how we want to stockpile this fall. I challenge each of you to at least take a small portion of your place and stockpile it. Stockpile a half acre per cow or even a 1/4 acre per cow. Prove to yourself that it works, and I promise you it's going to save you a lot of money down the road. I would be remiss if I didn't go ahead and mention that when I do this entire year-round grazing system presentation, what could we do when the Bermuda grass runs out around Christmas or the 1st of January or mid-January? And I always like to throw out there that our original stockpile grass in Oklahoma was our native grasses. Producers for well over 100 years have stockpiled that grass and ran cows on it all the way through the winter with nothing more than protein supplementation. We could do that in a system very easily following that Bermuda. Bermuda would weather quicker than native, so we want to utilize it quicker. And then we could go to a native grass system for maybe 30 days or 60 days, depending on the amount that we have in our pastures. And then also we could look at cool season forages, and maybe that's a perennial forage like fescue for some of us. If we're not in that area where we could grow fescue, we could look at some small grain options. And this is a picture from Perkins Research Station. We're also using about a 1/4 acre per cow of small grains, wheat, oat, rye mixture to basically replace supplement in that cow herd. So again, there's a lot of options we have that can get us to that near year-round grazing system. It takes a little time, it takes a little work, but typically in 3 to 5 years, you can have a really nice system put together that saves you quite a bit of money. I tell people every day we can get away from feeding hay and feed to a cow and making her do the work. We're going to save about $1 per cow per day. So again, I don't have enough time to go through all that tonight, but it's definitely something I hope you think about down the road. I put this data together a few years ago and ran this as an article. And I want you to think about this. You know, if we can add 60 days of winter grazing, I just showed you what the value of that 2-month period, that November, December period, if we can stockpile Bermuda, make the cow do the work and graze it, we're going to save about $1 per cow per day. So about $60, maybe more than that, maybe up to $100, depending on our system. If we equate that to how much weaning weight we would have to increase across our entire cow herd, we would have to add 42 pounds per calf of increased weaning weight by next year. We'd have to increase our weaning percentage by 5%, or we'd have to increase current market value by 5%. So my question to people is, you know, what do you think is going to be easier? Is it easier to go out and stockpile the Bermuda that you already have in your pasture, make the cow harvest it, and recognize those savings? Or is it easier to add 42 pounds of weaning weight across your entire herd by next year? And I think the answer is pretty easy. It's that low-hanging fruit. Make the cow do the work, utilize the forage at hand. Okay, with that, I'm going to wrap it up.
The 50 pounds of nitrogen that you put on looks like gave you about a 1.5% increase in your crude protein. But the big takeaway is that actually amount of actual forage that you got. You kind of got about a ton more, didn't you?
Yeah, are you talking about compared to like the hay?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, some of that may just be due to stage, stage of growth, where it was at in vegetative versus reproductive growth. So that first column was an actual hay sample that was baled early in the year. That was baled like in, our June timeframe, our normal hay baling time. Those latter two columns were the 2 years of stockpile sampled in November. So I probably should have pointed that out. So it's kind of hard to compare those and say the fertility made any difference, because that hay sample was fertilized hay as well that we were baling off the station in the summertime. And maybe what you're getting at is that fertility, you will see an increase in quality in the short term. So we can spike protein quite a bit in the first 2 to 4 weeks after application. And that's because crude protein is just a measurement of nitrogen in the forage. But what tends to happen is exactly what you said, that nitrogen also stimulates increased yield. And as we increase that yield, we tend to start diluting those nutrients back out, the protein and the TDN as well. We see more lignin deposition in the stem, more indigestible fibers. So what we do see is that if we look at 8-week-old Bermuda grass, fertilized versus unfertilized, there won't be a huge difference in quality between those two, but there will be a big difference in yield, with the fertilized making quite a bit more, about 1 ton of production more for each 50 pounds of N that we put down.
My question to you is, I don't have a strong cold winter or cold season grass. And my pastures are down towards Ada. And any recommendations on what I could plant cold season in that area?
Sure, that's a great question. And again, in that corridor, kind of that I-35 corridor, we're on the outskirts of traditional fescue country. Now we've got some newer varieties that have some promise for us. But I think for a producer like you wanting to look for a cool season component, which we really need in these grazing systems, the easiest thing to start off with is probably going to be annual ryegrass. Annual ryegrass is something that we can seed in the fall. We can seed it in September over the top of fairly short pastures. We don't need special equipment. We don't need to drill it into the soil. We can broadcast it right on top of the ground and get excellent stands. It's not going to make a lot of fall and winter production for you, but what it can do is make a lot of late winter production that basically shortens up that tail end of that hay and feeding season. So it can get us back to grazing quicker as we get into that, say, March timeframe, March, April, May. A lot of times we can be grazing annual ryegrass. And it does need to be managed with some fertility, but again, that's fairly easy to do, and it's very responsive to nitrogen. So that would be my first pick, even compared to like small grains. I love small grains, but they take quite a bit more equipment to get them in the ground and get them growing properly. So if you are planning on stockpiling Bermuda, keep your county educator posted on what you're seeing. We'd be glad to come out, take a look at it. Would love to grab some samples for you and kind of see what your quality is and track your progress. But again, we're seeing more and more producers utilize this strategy to really save some money and save a lot of labor. That's the thing I like about it most on my own cow herd.